First, a little bit about the United States Association for Energy Economics. We are the largest affiliate of the International Association for Energy Economics and provide a forum for the exchange of ideas, experience, and issues among professionals interested in the field. The organization produces 2 professional journals, a newsletter, and holds conferences and virtual presentations, along with a host of other products and services you can find on our website at www.usaee.org. If you're not already a member of the association, we welcome you to join. A few housekeeping matters in regard to today's webinar before I hand things over to our moderator. First, this webinar is being recorded for those that cannot participate in today's live event. If you have any questions for the panelists, please click the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom window and type your question. We've allocated sufficient time at the end of this webinar to address your questions. And now I would like to introduce you to our moderator, Amy Jaffe, who is the David M. Rubenstein Senior Fellow for Energy and Environment and the Director of the Program of Energy, Security, and Climate Change at the Council on Foreign Relations. Amy, over to you.
Thanks very much, Dave. Well, it's a pleasure to have everybody here with us today for today's timely webinar on the U.S. pipeline infrastructure and the potential for greening it. We couldn't be more newsworthy since the headlines are all swirling about environmental decisions related to major pipelines in the United States. Reaffirming the need for full environmental evaluation to the highest level, to the Supreme Court in one case. We are also seeing increased debate about energy infrastructure going forward as part of congressional stimulus, and also will probably be, infrastructure will be a piece of what gets debated as we move further into the presidential election cycle. So a lot of different political aspects that backdrop our discussion today. And also just a word to think about directionally, how the competition among different fuels is going to unfold in the United States. The New York Times had a very interesting piece this week asking the question as to whether or not natural gas is still considered the bridge fuel because it has adequately knocked out a lot of higher carbon coal over the last decade or two, and has contributed to a lowering of overall U.S. greenhouse gas emissions. But many people are asking the question, when does it cease to be a bridge fuel, and when does natural gas become a problem for decarbonization? So we will address some of those issues today. We have only a short period of time. We have some great experts, so I'm going to move right away to introduce them. And then each expert will make a short, brief presentation. I will then ask a question or two to get them in conversation with each other. And then we will open it up to your comments and questions, which you can indicate through the chat function or also through the Q&A function. So with that, I'm going to introduce our first speaker and then mention our other 2 speakers. Paula Gant is Senior Vice President for Strategy, Innovation, and New Ventures at Gas Technology Institute. She is a former Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary of International Affairs at the U.S. Department of Energy. Mark Brownstein is Senior Vice President for Energy at the Environmental Defense Fund. And our final speaker is Mary Finley-Brook, who is Associate Professor of Geography and Environment at University of Virginia and co-author of an article I highly recommend and published in 2018 called Critical Energy Justice in the U.S. Natural Gas Infrastructure. So with that, let me turn it over to Paula for her opening comments.
Good morning. Thanks, Amy. It's great to at least see some familiar faces today. I know we're all a little bit, I'm a little bit tired of just seeing myself on this video cam, I could tell you, as we were discussing earlier. So thanks for this opportunity. So I'm going to just provide some brief opening thoughts here to get the conversation going, because I think with this group we're going to have a robust conversation, I hope, and it should be interesting. And just share some thinking that we've been doing at GTI as we think about what energy systems are going to look like in a post-2030 world, and particularly the role that we think gases, liquid fuels, and infrastructure are going to play in that. So, in recognizing that we're also in this panel going to come back to today and sort of where the rubber hits the road today, but wanted to set the frame out in the future and how we're thinking about the requirements that energy systems are going to have to deliver as we look to meet dual imperatives of deeply decarbonizing energy systems in order to reduce emissions in the atmosphere so we can stay below 2 degrees of warming, while we also do that in a low-cost way that allows us to enable rising standards of living across the planet. So these systems are going to need to be low-cost and low-carbon, not one or the other. And that's a big challenge. And so we say that as a way of saying that really disruptive innovation is going to be needed, because we are not just looking to solve for decarbonization and economic growth here in this country, but to do that for the planet, solve for both of those at the same time, it means that we're going to need to deploy the heck out of solutions that we have available now to 2030, and start now getting really serious about some disruptive innovations to produce solutions at scale that are going to help us get to the goal post 2030 for these energy systems. At GTI, as we think about our role in helping to enable and shape those transitions, we're particularly focused on molecules, so gases and liquid fuels, and how we get those molecules where we need them, when we need them. So that's as vital as having an abundance of amount of energy. If you don't have it where you need it, when you need it, then particularly problematic. And as we look at global energy demand well out to mid-century, there is an expectation of continued robust demand for gases and liquids. In other words, electrons aren't how we're going to run our complete economies. They have a vital role, but they're still going to need gases and molecules to even enable electrification. And that's probably the thing that I want to put out there and for people to consider most importantly today as we think about this, that we need to begin to imagine a future in which gases and liquid molecules continue to play a role in how we consume energy, how we move it around, how they allow us to store and transport energy. And also begin to imagine those gases and liquid molecules made up of different things and consumed in different ways. So gases have a vital role in our long-term energy picture. We believe increasingly we're going to have gases made of different things that are increasingly low carbon, like renewable natural gas in the short term, moving to hydrogen in the longer term. And then we're going to have innovations in the processes that we use to either turn those gases into electrons that we need, or turn those gases and liquid molecules into chemicals and materials. So again, when we start to look at deep decarbonization, we have to think about an economy-wide perspective, and we're going to have to think about the role that gases and liquids play in that. So if we do that, then we really need to think about infrastructure. And it's really difficult to build infrastructure of any kind right now. And we're going to talk about some of the reasons why that is. But if it's going to continue to be difficult to build infrastructure, then it's all the more important that we figure out how to deploy the infrastructure that we have. So, I mean, I think we still have to work on how we're going to build new infrastructure, don't get me wrong. But we're going to also need to think about how we adapt existing infrastructure. And if we look at gas systems alone, and when I say gas systems, I mean, you know, large volume pipes, small volume distribution systems, above and below ground storage, peak shaving facilities, a whole variety in compressor stations, looping infrastructure. We have this robust infrastructure that allows us now to get gas molecules where we need them, when we need them. It delivers tremendous interseasonal storage already. Just the value on the books right now of that infrastructure. So this is the depreciated value of that infrastructure, is something around $400 billion. And that's depreciated value. So if the point being is, if for some reason we were going to set that infrastructure aside, that's a tremendous investment asset that we'd be foregoing, that we'd have to replace to just get back to even on the deliverability, the reliability, the efficiency, and the safety with which we deliver energy where it's needed in a lot of vital ways. Again, not just for homes built in buildings and light duty transport, but for heavy duty transport, for industrial processes, for chemical manufacturing, for aviation fuel, and the like. The variety of ways in which these systems support our quality of life. So we're particularly curious about how we're going to understand, and we have research underway to understand, for example, what is going to be the impacts of hydrogen-rich gas streams on those systems. What are the modifications that may need to be made in those systems, and the equipment that's connected to them as we transition through renewable methane to some carbon neutral gases to hydrogen over time. Also, we're very interested in how the system is going to interact with other systems, particularly electric systems that are increasingly dependent on renewable electrons like wind and solar. So for example, how do you think about turning wind and solar electrons in peak summer months into hydrogen? Or how do you think about turning them into ammonia so that you store them locally, and maybe you turn them back into hydrogen to move them across the country to meet your interseasonal need in the winter? So lots of interesting infrastructure questions. But the main point I think I would say is that we have a view that this infrastructure, that current infrastructure, is going to be needed. And if we were to think about, so some are suggesting that we maybe should strand it, then not only would that undermine our quality of life in this transition and economic vitality, but it would also be a real disservice to the communities in which this infrastructure has been sited, particularly at the local level, that would bear the cost of that transition. So we need to make sure this transition is just and cost effective for everyone. So we think there's a role to play for this infrastructure. And so I'm going to stop there. Can't hear you, Amy.
My computer said to me, "You're muted," and I thought, oh my God, I'm the moderator, and I didn't remember to unmute myself. Thank you very much for those comments, Paula. It's very interesting overview of kind of where we are and where we're going on a decarbonization pathway. We're having a technical problem, and so Mark Brownstein is not logged in right now, so I'm going to go on to
I'm here.
Oh, you're here. Oh, brilliant. Okay, you didn't appear on my screen. That's even better. Mark, you're next. Go ahead.
Okay, great. Well, thanks first of all for having me. Thank you, Amy, for serving as moderator here. I just want to take the opportunity maybe to talk about 3 key points. First is you know, I think we have to remind ourselves that as much as the headlines are about the difficulty of building new infrastructure, I think we have to remind ourselves that, first of all, the United States is awash in oil and gas infrastructure, right? We have a very mature delivery system in the United States. Maybe reasonable minds can differ about whether we need to incrementally add to that system, but let's not pretend that we don't already have the capacity to deliver huge amounts of hydrocarbons to where they need to go. But as it relates, and I should also say that there are plenty of places in the United States where construction on projects is proceeding apace and don't make much headlines. And maybe that leads to my next observation, which is that there have been some, high-profile cases of opposition to new infrastructure in the U.S. Whether you're talking about the Keystone Pipeline, of course, but the number of gas pipelines proposed to bring gas onto the eastern seaboard. And of course, many people are wondering, why is it so difficult to develop those projects, get them permitted? So I want to address myself to that. The first is that I think that we are, to the extent that it's difficult to permit new projects, it is a sign that we lack a comprehensive national climate policy. And that what you see happening is that because we don't have coherent climate policy at the national level, every project, as it goes through the permitting process, winds up having to justify itself in reference to what we know about climate science and what the science is telling us about where we need to go in terms of carbon reductions. Because we have no systematic way of arbitrating what projects are consistent with a low carbon future and which projects are inconsistent with a low carbon future. Each project, as it goes through the permitting process, winds up litigating those questions. Very inefficient way to do it. And so I honestly think that to some extent, to the extent that the oil and gas industry has played a role in stymieing the development of coherent national climate policy over the last several decades, that maybe the industry has sort of been the victim of its own success. And what I would hope to see in the next year or two is really an effort to right that wrong and to work to develop a coherent national climate policy, which in turn will make it easier for everyone to then, first of all, understand what the cost of the externalities are with regard to carbon pollution, be able to price that into the pro formas of the projects, but also to enable policymakers, whether those are state public service commissions or the FERC, to better evaluate whether the pipeline is actually going to be used and useful in the context of a world in which we are reducing carbon, not increasing carbon. So that's the first point. The second point is that I think what we're also seeing with new projects is that actually community concerns matter. And I won't spend too much time on this. I won't steal Mary's thunder, but I will just observe that, the events of the last several weeks, I think, both the George Floyd case and the national response to that, but also the simple fact that through the COVID crisis, we are seeing that this terrible disease, which is affecting all of us in some ways, are definitely affecting some of us, people of color, more than others. And so in both cases, we're seeing social and racial inequities really coming home to roost. And in fact, when you look at some of the most vocal opposition to some of these pipelines, it's coming from those very same communities that have been put upon time and time again, and who frankly now are saying enough is enough. And so I think until we as a society find ways to acknowledge that and address it, I think infrastructure development is going to continue to be very hard in the US. But the third point I want to make is that, and Paula alluded to this in her comments, the fact of the matter is the competitive landscape is shifting. You know, the ace card that I think folks in the oil and gas industry could play 10, 15, 20 years ago is that the product was fundamentally needed. But for the oil pipeline, there was no way to put gasoline in our cars. But for the natural gas pipeline, there was no other way to cook our food or heat our home. And I think what we're seeing in really just the last 10 years is an explosion of technological innovation that now begins to call into question whether oil and gas have that kind of monopoly on the basic energy needs of our economy. I'm not smart enough to know exactly what the trajectory of electric vehicles is going to be, but they're out there. And customers have choices, not just private vehicle owners, but fleet owners. You only need to look at the commitment that Amazon made to use electric vehicles in its fleet to understand that the days of oil's dominance over transportation are ending. And likewise with natural gas. I'm in the process of doing a home renovation right now, which we're putting in an electric heat pump. Okay, it's no longer the case that I need to use a gas-fired heat exchanger in order to heat my home or to heat my water. And spent time 2 weeks before the COVID crisis visiting my son, who was studying in Germany and had the opportunity to experience electric induction cooking. And I can tell you it's pretty good. And so what you're seeing at the end of the day is that now customers have choices, and I think policymakers have choices. You look at something like the Atlantic Coast Project, for whatever issues it had with regard to opposition of local communities or lack of attention to doing the hard work of environmental impact statements. The simple fact is the thing wasn't needed. The economies of the Eastern Seaboard are beginning to move away from natural gas dependence. And again, reasonable minds can differ over exactly what the pace of that trajectory is, but it's happening. We know for a fact New England does not need copious amounts of new gas capacity. Because again, as I started my comments, we already have very robust infrastructure going into all of these communities. And I really think at the end of the day, the fundamental question is how do we make more efficient use of the infrastructure that we have? Okay. And how do we continue the process of a responsible, equitable energy transition in which, frankly, some of this infrastructure becomes less important over time? Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much. Our next speaker will be Finley-Brook, and then we'll have a little discussion among ourselves, and then I'll open it for questions. I'm already seeing a few questions in the Q&A, so keep those going.
So I'm Dr. Mary Finley-Brook, and just to correct the original intro, I am from the University of Richmond, and I thank you for this opportunity. I think the perspective that I'm going to be sharing today is probably different than what many of you hear. And Amy encouraged me to draw, I'm going to share my screen here, from that 2008 article that was being referenced. That looked at gas infrastructure that I published with colleagues. And I really enjoyed revisiting this article and thinking about this webinar today. The main case studies I originally covered were Cove Point Export LNG Facility and the Atlantic Coast Pipeline, which I will definitely be talking about. But I've extended this to include other infrastructure. The picture that you're seeing here is, of course, from the Mountain Valley Pipeline. And this, in my assessment, this pipeline, and that is the assessment of many others, is a total boondoggle. And I will be coming back to that a little bit. But as an academic researcher, I want to point out, starting with my methodology, So my community-based participatory action research involves regular engagement with infrastructure impacted communities. And so that is the perspective I'm here to share today. And it also obviously includes a lot of students. And I have students working with me on this type of research this summer. And again, both of these groups, impacted residents and students, are joining the webinar today. I promised to keep my remarks just to a few minutes so that we do have that time for dialogue. So I've put more in my slides than I'm going to actually cover in my presentation. They are available. They'll be available on the website afterwards if you want to come back to them. But as a political ecologist, what I want to start with is what I see as the crux of the problem, and it is structural power inequality. This leads to a disproportionate impact, and that's both in the negatives and in the positives. So the fact that there is not a level playing field, and there's a lot on this slide, has many consequences. It certainly is one of the things leading to our greenhouse gas emissions and our climate crisis. But there's this unfair distribution of harm as a result of power plays, really people who can throw their weight around, companies who can throw their weight around, maybe I should say. In technical terms, I call this procedural injustice. And the Mountain Valley Pipeline is a project that is dangerous due to the slope of terrain. It was permitted just so many miles that go through terrain that is causing a lot of problems. It's an irresponsible project because of the number of environmental violations that are not being corrected, even though they've been brought up repeatedly. But what I'm going to focus on here is the now defunct Atlantic Coast Pipeline, the ACP, and I'm going to quote our former Vice President Al Gore, called it a reckless, racist ripoff. This pipeline never should have been approved. Every push through the various stages of permitting was problematic. And the one that I'm going to focus on here is in my slide on the bottom right regarding Governor Northam's overreach, where he yanked 2 Air Board members that were asking hard questions right in the middle of a permitting decision. And this was, I remember this so clearly because this procedural unfairness caused me and countless of other people to really double down on our efforts to make sure that this project did not go through, because it was not being given the environmental review that it needed. But before this, what should have been the Air Board's date to actually make a permit decision, Dominion Energy suddenly announced a $5 million payout to the local company. Many of you maybe followed that, but it was really taken as a bribe that's how people felt in Virginia, that it was taken as a bribe to convince people that this harm was actually going to be okay, that there was going to be this trade-off, there was going to be these negatives, but here you go, here's some positives too. Anybody who knows Union Hill, the proposed site of the Buckingham compressor station, knows these 2 gentlemen in the photograph here. Both men are deeply rooted in this rural freedman community, and their family lands are adjacent. When I took this photograph, one of these individuals was an employee of Dominion Energy and was the key promoter of the project. When I took this photograph last summer, he actually had 1 foot out the door already, but the other person in the photograph has been a leader of the opposition to the very end. And what we're doing in this photograph here, this is on the same day, is we're hosting a fish fry. This was last summer, and this is the cleanup crew that you're seeing at the end of the event. We're promoting reconciliation as a result of the deep, deep trauma that happens when compressor station proposals like this come into small communities. And I will say this upcoming summer and fall, we're going to continue to have events and processes for healing the conflict that has happened in Union Hill as a result of this project and the whole permitting process as it happened. But Mr. Walker, who's next to me in this larger photograph and is shown here in both of these small photographs, that were also taken in Union Hill, is promoting solar training with Bridging the Gap. And Richard's become an advocate for community. I want to talk about energy democracy. I want to talk about going a lot further than what I just heard in a lot of those introductions, where people actually being involved in the creation of their own energy. And why this happened for Richard, why he became an advocate for community-based renewable energy, was his direct experience with the ACP. His family land was caught in a lawsuit over a disputed easement, and that was where the 54,000 horsepower compressor station hooked up with Williams Transco pipeline and the ACP. So what I'm hoping to teach you here with this slide, which is from that 2018 article, is that anti-pipeline activists are not just climate activists. Some of you might think that. We tend to love the places, communities, and regions where we live, and we're willing to work to defend these people and places that we love. We also learn from and support a growing network of anti-fossil fuel activists nationally and internationally. That's my networking across space. For example, I have never met my counterparts who are opposing the Weymouth compressor station, but I feel a deep connection to their struggle since I started learning from them 5 years ago. And I have to point out that the Weymouth compressor construction continues even though that permit has been revoked, and that there have been unpermitted toxic blowdowns recently. And this is the type of activity in gas buildout that is entirely unacceptable and really encourages this type of ongoing movement. What I seek to point out is that some of you may be listening to this trying to figure out how to stop anti-pipeline activism. And my point is we will be invincible for a couple of reasons. One is our commitment to climate action. And as we know, that's getting more and more urgent. But number two, because we understand sustainability requires a range of social and ecological and economic. We do understand the economics of this and the externalities of all the air and water pollution, as well as the climate pollution that are being left out. And fossil fuel and fossil gas particularly as what people, that introduction saying it's a bridge fuel, people like me would say, what decade are we in? That we've stopped saying that language. It is actually, it is something that is unsustainable from the frac pads all the way through the entire process. And so the anti-fossil fuel movement grows because so many of us have been directly harmed. And we have seen people that we love suffer. This is happening if you talk about New England, but if you talk about California, Texas, people have experienced this directly. Yet each step of the way, state agencies govern what I call by box checking. And those who have been through it, you know exactly what I'm talking about. I also call it bureaucratic violence. And they segment, everything is segmented. And then they say everything's irrelevant that doesn't fit in the segment that they've created in a model. And then they intentionally ignore whatever doesn't fit their bias towards approval. And it's the people who are in charge of the approval that say whether public comments are given consideration. Every single public comment I've ever made on the record, and I've done a lot of these, I've been told was irrelevant. Not to the communities themselves, but to the permit writers. And this leaves communities to suffer the consequences of ineffective regulation and poor oversight. So before I wrap up, I do want to use a couple of brief examples. Ideally impacted communities people should speak for themselves. And I hope those of you with the media, I think there's some people with media that are paying attention to this. I hope you communicate directly with local populations. That's why I've put on here contact information. But here's my Environmental Justice 101 course. Charles City County, I hope some of you have heard of this. You will if you haven't already. It provides some lessons for those who might want to build a large gas-fired power plant, or in this case, two. So there are two, and I'm not just making this up, there are two merchant plants. They are equivalent to more than 2,700 megawatts of new gas, and they're being put in just over 1 mile in proximity. And so if you don't know anything, say this is your proposal and you would like to do this type of development and you don't know anything about your host community, the fact that there are dozens of historic tobacco plantations that remain vibrant symbols of white supremacy, and this is located in a county with a history of lynching. If you look at the side in the middle, there's a Confederate monument that I'm showing here on the right that was constructed 4 decades after the end of slavery. All of these could be signs that you need to investigate a little bit more deeply to find out about social inequality in history, and make sure your permits are not being premised on the abuse and silencing of people of color, which is exactly what has happened in this process. And if you look up this case, you're going to see there has been a lot more controversy over it. But the concerned citizens of Charles City County, C5, recently contacted the investors of one of these projects and pointed out that there was some hypocrisy in their issuing a Black Lives Matter statement very recently, saying they wanted to be part of the problem while financing a dangerous merchant gas plant in an area that is at least 50 to 60%, it's probably more, people of color, and they would be exposed annually to tons of particulate matter and pounds of hazardous air pollutants. My second case, and we'll go quickly here, this involves a mega landfill because I don't want you to think I only understand or work on pipelines. But this is being permitted outside of Richmond, Virginia in Cumberland County. Some of you might focus on recycling in the name here or the fact that it's Green Ridge, and you may think it's an environmentally sustainable project. I will come to its environmental components in the next slide. But first, what I need to point out is that it is being built in a historic African-American district as a racially segregated Rosenwald school. Pine Grove, which you're seeing in this picture here, was the only option for education of Black children for more than 50 years. And the elders you see here in the photograph are former students who just months ago obtained historical recognition for this site after years of hard work. These civil rights leaders are facing displacement of their cultural and educational center because of a large, and I'm going to say it, stinking, if you've lived near a landfill, they stink. No matter what you do, they stink. Located directly across the street, displacing the entrance road to the school museum, but much worse, disrupting the burial grounds of their family members. This is located within the footprint of this large mega landfill site. So I know that this audience may have an affinity for landfill gas. I encourage you to analyze emissions for sites from this holistically. It is yet to be built. There's some major design flaws, and this isn't just one project. Virginia imports gas from all over. Not gas, we import garbage from all over. But one of the major design flaws is the fact that we have these low tipping fees. And so there's going to be trucks, hundreds of trucks a day bringing trash from as much as 500 miles away. And think about the greenhouse gas emissions leakage that are not captured if you're really focusing on that methane at the point of decomposition. This project is so much more than that. And particularly, we find that there has been insufficient waste diversion, and we find these in these types of waste to energy projects all over the world. I work internationally, so I'm focused on Virginia here, but I really want you to know that these trends continue internationally. We find that there is not waste diversion prior to these, in this instance, large dump trucks with horrible mile per gallon. These are not new technology trucks, and they're driving these long distances. So there's other ecological issues in this project. One is that the liner is the thinnest that you can get away with legally. The site has several wetlands. They feed into streams connecting to the James River. The leachate from this imported trash may end up in the drinking water of myself and thousands of people who live downstream, making the promotion of a mega project like this, because of its methane recovery, which is something that does happen, seem like greenwashing. You have to look more broadly at what these projects do. A similarity with Trail City, and I know I'm almost out of time here, is that the energy from these merchant gas plants is exported to a regional grid. It is not necessary to site this in a historic African American or Native community. Of course, many of them are sited exactly in these types of places. It's a pattern. It does not need to be drawing the water that is in a threatened part. It's the Potomac Aquifer. So we do not need to be drawing where we have water problems in this area. So putting a gas plant in a time of climate change, where there's going to be more future problems. And this is the low-income rural area. They're already living with a landfill, and I can go on and on. People believe there's a cancer cluster associated with it. Yes, there's methane recovery, but there is also a lot of other notices of violations that have gone on repeatedly. And it's in an industrial corridor. So there is a pollution burden leading to pre-existing health conditions. This is an environmental justice community. I am going to stop there because I know I'm out of time. But what I hope I've given you is some things to think about, and I will leave it there for questions and discussion. Thank you.
Great. Okay. Let's go forward. I'm going to ask a couple of questions to get us kicked off, and I have a whole bunch of questions from our participants. So looking forward to doing those as well. So my first question is for all the panelists, and that question is stimulated by Mark's comments. Is there something in federal policy that would actually resolve or could guide some of these community-related issues? So beyond, the carbon issue itself, is there something that needs to be done or could be done at the federal level that would be effective on these community issues, or are those things have to be Mark, you want to go first?
Great. Sure. So a couple of things, right? So first of all, as it relates to carbon, clearly a limit in price on carbon at the national level would go a long way towards internalizing the externalities so that both developers and policymakers, PUCs and otherwise, can more fairly evaluate the economics of the projects given the carbon footprint. Second, we're in the process now of battling an administration that's actually trying to unwind methane regulations for new oil and gas facilities. Methane drives a quarter, if not a third, of the warming that we're experiencing right now. Methane emissions, methane pollution associated with oil, gas production and use, it goes right to the heart of natural gas's value proposition, to the extent that there is a value proposition, as a transition fuel or as a part of a low carbon strategy. It's interesting to note that in Europe, where they're talking about hydrogen, they have explicitly, as of yesterday, announced that part of their hydrogen policy will be addressing methane emissions associated with natural gas as a feedstock, right? So that's a federal regulatory challenge that we need to address. And as it relates to community concerns, I mean, you know, Mary's much more expert in this than I am, but I'll just observe that we have to get back to regular order with regard to proceedings at the FERC. You know, there was a time when the FERC operated in very straightforward and sort of what I'll call nonpartisan manner. As an environmental advocate, I always felt like I got a fair hearing there. I didn't always get the result I wanted, but I always felt treated respectfully by both staff and commissioners and felt heard. I can't say that now, unfortunately. And just the simple fact that we don't even have a full complement of FERC commissioners tells you something about some of the challenges that we're facing. So something as simple as getting back to regular order at FERC, I think, can go a long way. If you want community groups to have faith that the process is capable of hearing and considering what they have to say, you have to actually then have a process that one can honor. And I really worry right now that that we don't.
We can't hear you, Amy.
Okay, I'm going to start with questions that are coming in because questions are pouring in from our participants and we have limited time, so I'm going to go to those questions. The first, I want to put together two questions, Paula, for you from your presentation. We have a question about where you see the role of virtual pipeline peaking, and that is trucked LNG and CNG, and then also a question for how high you think biogas and biomethane can grow in the next decade.
So I would say if we're focused on I'm focused in post-2030 right now, and in a post-2030 field of vision, we need solutions at scale. And I think, so if we're looking at solutions at scale, I don't think that us thinking about trucking liquids is going to get us to the level of deliverability we need for those systems. They'll play a role, but we're going to need much larger storage and carriage solutions to move increasingly low carbon molecules around. So I think there's some serious solutions at scale. We're going to be thinking about putting low carbon molecules in existing storage infrastructure and moving it through pipes, but as well as thinking about the role, for example, that ammonia might play stored at different ends of those pipes. For example. We see tremendous opportunities for renewable methane in the short term, very near term, moving beyond biodigesters and looking at gasification technologies, so taking things like timber waste and agricultural waste as providing the next expansion of options for renewable methane as well as renewable hydrogen. We have several technologies for taking different forms of biomass and turning them into renewable methane and renewable hydrogen using gasification processes. One that we're working to take to industrial scale in a startup company we've created called SunGas that we think has some interesting applications along the Gulf Coast paired with industrial use. So we see opportunities there. We also see the midterm opportunities for some carbon neutral processes, and then plenty of opportunities to turn those renewable electrons into zero carbon gases in these systems as well. If I could quickly address this question about what the federal question you asked, Amy, from a technology perspective, because happily that's where I get to focus right now, rather on these sticky policy issues. But one of the things, in addition to these systems being low cost and low carbon, that we are focusing on is this point that decisions are going to be made at the local level. And that's not actually something new. All politics is local, and investment decisions about energy infrastructure get made at the local level. They always have. We just now increasingly have a variety of ways in which information is in the hands of local officials or landowners or community members. And what I believe we're facing right now is it's hard to turn that information into action in a way that has a comprehensive view and allows us to smartly design energy systems. And if there's one thing I'd like to see and we're thinking about is how we can design systems analysis tools that are human focused for these communities to use with a variety of stakeholders who are increasingly going to be different stakeholders bringing different solutions into these systems, so that we can make better decisions at the local level that address not only efficiencies, but also some of the injustices and concerns that have been set out here today.
Excellent. Thank you for those comments, Paula. So I'm going to pose a question to Mary, but then for sure, if one of the other panelists would also like to chime in. We've gotten a couple questions about sort of the desirability on these social justice issues of different kinds of facilities. So would hydrogen pipelines be any better in terms of social justice concerns? Or are we really just, because we're talking about routing infrastructure, it's really a routing question and a fairness question in terms of routing. I cite, in past pipelines where it got diverted away from a wealthy community through to a poor community, or to an indigenous community. And then that also, I think, pertains because, one of the big solutions on the decarbonization side, of course, is electrification. But Russell Gold of the Wall Street Journal has written a brilliant book about the near impossibility of siting transmission infrastructure. And then another participant raised the question about social justice issues when it comes to the cost burdens of who pays for renewable energy infrastructure and the costs of intermittency. And does that get transmitted to all ratepayers equally? Do corporations get the tax break, but then low-income residents wind up with any higher costs? Or how are we distributing the relative savings from renewables or the cost of renewables, and how do we address that moving forward? Mary, I'm going to pitch that to you.
So a lot of different questions there, and so many of them, and I see some other ones in the chat that are just wonderful. I'm obviously not going to be able to answer them all, but one of the ones I would like to focus on, and I would love to talk about renewables and some of these alternatives that, while you'd think that they are sustainable, I've done research on human rights violations in the renewable sector. So I'm not somebody that suggests that it's the type of energy only by itself that you need to look at. You do need to look at those imbalances, and you do need to look at how you pay for it. And so one of the things things I hope that we have in this conversation is how long we've subsidized fossil fuels and all of the externalities that all of us are paying in healthcare costs, that all of us are paying all over the economy with air and water pollution and climate change. And so as people look and say, well, renewable energy is too expensive, what have they taken into consideration when they say coal was cheap or gas was cheap? Was it really cheap, or did we just push that off into other people and pay for it other ways? And so one of the things I would want to think about in this transition, and as I look at energy type, and I have looked at many, is that how many jobs does it provide? How is it actually helping the economy in that way? If we're saying that we really want to have is the sustainability where we're helping low-income communities, or where we're having this just transition, why aren't we considering the number of jobs that are produced? And when you put in a massive solar farm, you're not producing the same amount of jobs as if you did rooftop solar, which we have a really hard time doing. Brownfield solar, which is the type of solar that would really be important for us to be pushing out, and instead we cut down forests. So it's how you do it. It isn't just the actual type of energy system. It's because there's so much inequality, so many externalities, and so much political imbalance that even if you put these policies in place, those with power are going to have a runaround. The last thing I want to make, and I want to leave time for other people, the other point that I want to make is that in this period of COVID, and as we're having recessions, potentially recessions that come out of this around the world, potentially for years, we really need to rethink what we say is ideal energy mix and how much we're going to be pushing out projects that are going to fail and future stranded assets, when we really need to be thinking more for that long-term transition. And this would be a time to do some of that disruption. I know we're already disrupted, but we're not necessarily doing well to help out those corporations that are causing most of the ecological damage and a lot of the social harm. I will pass on there. This is my energy efficiency lighting kicking in, and I will pass over to other people.
So, Amy, just one thought as I'm listening to this and thinking about it, genuine community engagement over energy and energy future needs to happen long before you get to the point where a particular project is being permitted. If you wait to the point at which you're permitting a project to engage a local community, you're probably already starting, 10 steps behind. So I do sort of wonder, and to Paula's point, right, a lot of energy decision making happens at the state and local level. So in the United States. So to what degree are states and localities engaging communities in conversations about energy, existing energy infrastructure, and future needs for energy infrastructure? And also, how are those state and local policymakers thinking about the trade-offs between things like hardware and what I'll call software or regulatory reforms, right? There's a lot in the electric space, and I came out of the electric and gas utility business, right? In the electric space, there's a lot that can be done just simply with creative tariff design that may obviate the need for some of the infrastructure that we're building to serve peak demand. And some of those structures, some of those tariff reforms can actually be very beneficial to mid and low income communities, because it actually helps them avoid peak costs. So if we're having a more proactive conversation with people, I think that we can head some of this off at the past. And that is fundamentally what abolishing systematic racism is all about. It's taking people on the front end and not just trying to placate them on the back end.
So let me add to that for a minute, then I'm going to turn to Paula. One of the things they've done in New York City is they have found that they could eliminate the need for giant new generation facilities by going to these places where they're having these peak loads that are not being met and having a call for solutions. So in other words, not having the utility dictate exactly what the solution is, but having providers bid for call for solutions. And they're finding that some distributed solutions have turned out to save the ratepayers, billions of dollars in centralized facilities that didn't need to be built because some small scale solutions were able to fix a grid instability problem at a much lower cost. So what Mark's saying, kind of resonates with me because I've seen that in my experience working here in New York. So Paula, do you have any thoughts on, because you've given a lot of thought to it, and I know GTI is about to embark on a study on this topic, to how we integrate these potential technologies with the kinds of things we're talking about in terms of the regulatory framework for how to fit which technology to what location and to which problem, and how to work that into reform of rate base and the way utilities function.
Thanks, Amy. This is why we think setting out this vision of long-term energy systems is really important. It's not a way to set aside the problems of today. It's a way to help us put them into a longer-term framework around a shared vision of what we want our communities to look like and what we need, right? We need a planet we can live on, and we need economies that can support human life on that planet, right? And everything that rolls into that. So a long-term vision that reflects that systems are going to increasingly be integrated. The systems that we see today, and we tend to think of as operating separately, even though they don't. We think about electric transmission and gas pipelines and liquid pipelines, and we don't really think about how they're already integrated. In the future, they're going to move different molecules. They're going to interact in different ways, and decisions about that are going to be made not just as we decide how we're going to electrify homes and buildings and light duty transport. They're going to be made to try to enable economic growth, right, through industry and manufacturing and heavy duty transport. But those start at the local level. And right now, I think what we've heard is that we have a lot of processes that are solving for individual criteria, like some processes are solving for emissions, some processes are solving for used and useful, some are solving for reliability or resilience or affordability. But we don't have mechanisms at the local level for people to think about solving for all of those at once, which is actually what we need these decision processes to do, because that's what we need these energy systems to do. So taking this large understanding of the integrated nature of these systems and bringing it down to this local level, one of the tools that we're beginning to develop is an integrated systems lab that has a physical component as well as a digital twin component. And we're starting with homes and buildings. How do you begin to model those and demonstrate how some of these new solutions that are going to come in to homes and buildings and communities are going to work together and create a digital twin of that, so that you can then provide communities, and for us, it's our customers and our partners that are in those communities, with tools to engage in decision making that has a long-term impact, because all of these decisions do. So that's something we're really excited on, that we're just getting started on it, but it speaks to this. Decisions are going to be made at the local level, and we've got to break down the silos on how that's happening. And that's the framework within which a bunch of these process improvements that Mary and Mark have pointed out that need to take place, whether they're national policy or local policy, or just how we behave when we interact with one another, can take shape.
Well, listen, I want to thank the panel. We're out of time, and I just really want to thank the panel for a really invigorating discussion. I think we came out with some interesting observations about the regulatory process and the approval process for new infrastructure. I'm hoping there's a bunch of members of USAEE who are academics beyond Mary that have been listening today and might be able to work with organizations like GTI or others in putting forward some great research in this area. So I really enthusiastic and thank our panelists and thank our great participants for their very interesting questions that drew out not just what the problem is, but actually drew out some very interesting ideas for solutions. So now I have the honor to bring it back to Dave Williams to close us up with a few procedural notes. Let me mention that a recording of this session will be on the USAEE website along with Mary's slides. So Dave, back over to you.
Thank you, Amy. Wow, what a wonderful webinar. I know I personally have learned quite a bit. Wish to thank you very much for organizing this, Amy, as well as GTI for supporting, and our distinguished panelists for really an outstanding webinar. As Amy mentioned, this webinar will be archived on USAE's Rewind page. Should be online this afternoon. As a reminder, if you're listening to this and you're not already a member of USAE, we encourage you to join by visiting us at www.usae.org. Thank you for attending, and I officially close this webinar.